started, if everyone's welcome to our panel, Color and Creed, Political Theologies in Pentecostal and Evangelical Churches. I think we'll aim for the 15-minute time for your comments, and we'll save questions and comments for the end. So first we're going to be hearing from Valerie Cooper from Duke Divinity School, and she'll be speaking to us on racial segregation in evangelical churches and the statement on social justice and the gospel.
Now we'll hear from Kenneth Johnson, talking about Black cultural sovereignty and the political theology of the Black church.
I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank again Telos for its kind invitation to present today. The title of this presentation is Black Cultural Sovereignty and the Political Theology of the Black Church. For my time this afternoon, I will give an overview of the Black Church and its origins, and then delineate how this manifests itself in a political theology. I will also suggest that instead of the notion of sovereignty a la Carl Schmitt, what is really needed for African Americans is a notion of cultural subsidiarity, cultural self-assertion, or cultural self-direction, in distinct opposition to some of the earlier Black nationalisms that came to fruition in the later 1960s and the 1970s. Let me start with a true story. On August 31, 2018, there was a signal event in American cultural history. This was the funeral ceremony, we call it a homegoing ceremony in the Black church tradition, of Aretha Franklin in her hometown of Detroit. In addition to her well-known musical artistry as the Queen of Soul, she was also one of the finest gospel singers of her generation. In addition to the many political and celebrity luminaries, there was also a significant presence of Black clergy, some prominent and others not so much. The eulogist was the Reverend Jasper Williams Jr. from the Salem Baptist Church in Atlanta, who was invited by the family to preach, as is often customary at these ceremonies. However, Reverend Williams took the opportunity in front of a live national and international audience to bring a disquisition not so much about the spiritual merits of the departed, but rather discussed a number of current negative conditions in the African American community. Reverend Williams decried the absence of jobs in many Black communities, and specifically the absence of small businesses owned and operated by African Americans, which tend to more readily hire local residents. He also drew attention to the ongoing challenge of Black-on-Black violence, something which in his view was not present in earlier generations in Black communities. He described the problem of father absence and the decline of the Black nuclear family in the lives and the upbringing of Black children. He also implicitly criticized the Black Lives Matter movement, stating that Black lives really did not matter until and unless residents in Black communities could find ways to calm the violence and other social pathologies in their communities. His sermon was, in the tradition of Black Baptist churches, about 1 hour in length. And the following Sunday at his church, he completed his disquisition. After the funeral, the family expressed their disappointment at the content of the eulogy, and certain newscasts, like Fox News, mentioned the sermon and its contents as a possibly true, but nevertheless quirky oddity, while many other news outlets, especially those associated with the progressive left, condemned it. Clearly, the sermon was inappropriate as a venue. But a more interesting question is what brought on this content in such a time and place where such discussions rarely occur. One might find quite pointed discussions about the African American condition in a Black barbershop, or in between discussions about sports teams. It is also possible that black beauty parlors have also these discussions, but since I do not frequent them, I would have to rely upon the testimony of black women. However, these discussions almost never occur outside of black forums. The very idea of exposing such candid conversations, normally internal to the black community itself, to a national and international audience is unprecedented. But we can ask, why did the preacher choose this moment? And was there any truth to what he said? And if there was any truth to it, how might these conditions be remedied or mitigated? So now let me begin, as some philosophers do, to define a few terms. The black church is that religious institution that predominates among Protestant African Americans. For the purposes of today's discussion, African Americans are defined as historic African Americans, meaning those people with at least one ancestor of African descent who was resident in the United States in 1865 before the end of the Civil War. The significance of this is that in addition to the end of military hostilities, the Civil War also ended formal chattel slavery of blacks in the U.S. The first black churches were the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in 1816 in Philadelphia, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, founded in 1822 in New York City. In both cases, black parishioners sought to worship with white Methodists on a basis of equality. In at least one case, they were removed from a white Methodist sanctuary because they were black. As a result of these indignities, the black parishioners decided to leave and form their own churches where they could worship Jesus without humiliation. It must be remembered that these churches and denominations were created in the North, outside from where slavery ruled. In the American South, black worshiped in secret, outside of the view and the hearing of the slave masters and their minions, in swampland, brush arbors, and other secluded places where they could pray and praise God. Historian Albert Rabbitoe described this as the invisible institution, and in light of several slave rebellions, a few with religious inspiration, slave masters were highly motivated to put forth their own gloss on Christianity, with particular emphasis on the Proverbs and on some of the writings of the Apostle Paul, especially those passages commanding slaves to obey their masters. But as Eugene D. Genovese noted in his book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, the enslaved took the Bible witness and reconfigured it to apply to their own situation. The Exodus narrative is the urtext for the black church, along with the gospel witness and discussions of Jesus. The early seeds of political theology was planted there. When enslaved black people decided to use the imagery of freedom as depicted in the biblical texts, interpreting them in an entirely different manner from the slave master's religion. After the Civil War, black denominations grew in size and churches spread out to wherever African Americans were to be found. Methodists and Baptists emerged, with Pentecostals coming into existence later under the leadership of the Reverend William J. Seymour at the historic Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles in 1906, where the Pentecostal gifts of the Spirit, such as the gift of tongues, miraculous healing, and prophetic utterances, laid the basis for modern Pentecostal charismatic movements throughout the U.S. and worldwide with over 600 million adherents. During this time, the black church became an entirely black-owned and operated institution that has journeyed with African Americans through the slavery period, through Reconstruction, and the legal regime of Jim Crow segregation that legalized political and social exclusion and segregation up to the current day. It remains the most fundamental pro-social institution in the African American community, long after the passing of secular alternatives, such as black nationalism, black power, black consciousness, and the black arts movement. Today, over 30 million African Americans attend worship services at least monthly, and the vast majority attend every Sunday. The function of the Black church, in addition to providing moral and cognitive order in Black communities and economic resources and social services, also faced up to the political conditions that African Americans had to endure. Black churches and other civic groups began to organize politically, such as advocating for anti-lynching laws, economic development projects, and the building of elementary schools and higher education institutions. Following this, other campaigns began to secure the right to vote, fair housing, and working with community organizers along legal efforts led by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and other organizations to fight segregation. It should also be noted that the NAACP chapters in the South were created inside Black churches. The overwhelming majority of activists during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s were practicing Christians in the Black church tradition, and the political strategies, tactics, and worldview were imbued with a Judeo-Christian sensibility that came from a liberatory reading of the Bible. Now we can ask, how can such an institution that prevailed against slavery, segregation, and manifold forms of social exclusion, while at the same time being the origins of key elements of American culture, including musical forms like the blues, jazz, and gospel music, and which, in Martin Luther King's language, attempted to re-summon Americans to fulfill the promises of justice and equality. That institution seems now to be at risk of slipping into irrelevance in terms of facing up to the difficult conditions in African American communities. Some of the sources of these problems originate in government policy, whether the direct harms of urban renewal, or as some used to call it, Negro removal, to displaced residents, and also the denial of equal access of veterans' benefits for home loans after World War II, which could have laid the foundation for future Black wealth, or more recently, the reality of mass incarceration through the war on drugs, especially at the state level, which has served to effectively exclude many African American men from the inner cities from gainful legal employment after they return from jail or prison. Other sources include the disruption of the Black nuclear family, both through economic forces and through cultural changes that involve the slippage of historic marital and sexual norms by Black people in favor of more flexible lifestyle choices, aided and abetted by the sexual revolution that affected and continues to affect most American communities since the late 1960s. While many African Americans have entered the mainstream, even if on a precarious basis, there is still about 20 to 25% of Blacks in the inner cities and rural areas, the same faces, in the same places, year after year, decade after decade, stuck with little prospect for upward mobility. While other institutions of the state consistently fail, like our wretched public education system, sabotaging the development of intellectual and cultural capital to facilitate entrance into higher education or trade schools, it is a perfect storm that has served to hinder those left behind with darkening options in light of the technological changes of the fourth industrial revolution that is the process of reshaping labor and the economy. There have been past attempts to address this problem by creating cultural solidarity within the African American community. W.E.B. Du Bois attempted this in terms of literary, artistic, and other forms of cultural self-assertion by Blacks. Marcus Garvey, while not an historical African American, he was from Jamaica, also did the same and added a potential political nationalism in the form of voluntary repatriation of Black Americans to Africa. Unfortunately, some other Black nationalisms were attempted, starting with Black Power, then revolutionary Pan-African nationalism, and finally a variant of Black cultural nationalism that had very little political impact, but did add some minor economic benefit for the vendors of kente cloth, dashikis, and Kwanzaa ornaments. In the meantime, there are over 10,000 Black elected officials in the U.S. today. While some govern wisely, many others are ineffective, which serves to confirm the general critique of government and the administrative state that Telos theorists like editor Paul Piccone and the Marxian scholar Adolph Reed, as well as black political theories such as Carol Swain, warned against. Despite the failed black nationalisms, black America has generally not engaged in the nasty nationalisms that characterize other parts of the world, like the current ferment in Eastern Europe, Greece, France, and elsewhere in Western Europe. There is a spirit of black self-assertion, or better yet, an aspiration for cultural subsidiarity and particularity, nevertheless embedded in the universality of American values as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as amended. It might be that African Americans are proto-nationalists and do nationalism better than in other places. This is especially salient in that there is no tradition of religious terrorism in the black community or in black American history, with a possible exception of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, who led abortive and short-lived slave rebellions. The president of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, the late Reverend Dr. J.H. Jackson, liked to describe his denomination as a church with the soul of the nation. This could well describe the role of the black church as a whole. The ethno-cultural particularity of the black church, due to its historic duration, tends to transcend conventional notions of identity politics or the politics of recognition, while also retaining a principled hope and a rejoinder against Afro-pessimism that has become trendy among black millennials and black academics. The discomfort here is a paradox. More social acceptance of African Americans, especially in media, sports, and even politics, like the election of President Barack Obama. Some things like public accommodation and the overthrow of legal segregation are indeed great achievements. However, many things were lost, like the cohesive African American neighborhoods and the exposure of sources of black wealth to competition by the white capital structure, like the diminishment of African American banks or banking and the elimination of the plethora of black life and health insurance companies in less than a generation. Blacks in many communities no longer even own their own funeral homes. Many of these have been bought out by a white mortuary corporation in Canada that retains the staff and signage of black funeral homes, but the money immediately flows out of the community. Even liquor stores, which are legion in black communities, are largely no longer owned by blacks, and are now owned by people from India, and in the city of Oakland, by Yemeni Muslims. This is what Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson described as the ordeal of integration. Perhaps a solution to these deficits could be found in a notion of cultural subsidiarity, with the idea that African Americans should no longer be the wards of the state, but instead should be free to have more control over their neighborhoods and daily affairs, while ever getting better and equal access to the tax dollars that they contribute. This does not mean racial separation by any means, nor any form of anti-white attitudes. The African-American historian Harold Cruz, quoting the cultural critic Randolph Bourne, described the U.S. as being a, quote, botched cultural fusion, close quote. While black Americans are well embedded in American culture, they still do not benefit fully as citizens of the Republic in all dimensions. Paul Piccone, founder of Telos, was an advocate of regionalism, cultural particularity, federalism, and subsidiarity as bulwarks against the commodification of culture and the unchecked growth of the administrative state, which has also been a blight on African Americans seeking to regulate many elements of black life that would be better handled internally by blacks themselves. The core concept of subsidiarity is to get solutions and power closest to those most affected. It has been a vital part of Roman Catholic social teaching. Or as a theorist of community organizing, Saul Alinsky once wrote, quote, do nothing for anyone that they can do for themselves, close quote. Part of a subsidiary solution may entail a rethinking of blackness, We now know that conventional racial classifications lack a scientific basis, instead being social constructs that arose depending on whose historiography is accepted, either in the late Renaissance or during the European Enlightenment. We might do better to refer to the slight genetic and phenotypical differences among human beings as human clades, part of the same species with slight differentiation, like for medical purposes. Instead of blackness as a race, we might instead consider blackness as a form of peoplehood. Furthermore, and more provocatively, we might want to consider membership in blackness as peoplehood as an act of political will. This could be effective as a way to address the presence of mixed-race persons and cultural expatriates from whiteness or from other racial and ethnic groups. In short, a voluntary covenantal community rather than the forced racial categories. If this was attempted, this also might require a rethinking of certain programmatic efforts around diversity and inclusion, which are mutations of the original purposes of affirmative action to address the historic injustices committed against historic African Americans. Evasion of this task has resulted in the way affirmative action yields of multiculturalism and layered diversity in higher education as well as in the corporate sector. The evasion of redress for the exclusion of African Americans relates to Harold Cruz's observation in his final book, Plural but Equal, that the U.S. Constitution and its related traditions of jurisprudence in their current forms have been unable to provide effective group remedies, with the possible exception of Native Americans, whose tribes are considered sovereign under American law. Let me conclude by stating that the American secular state has been unable to resolve the plight of the 20 to 25% of African Americans who are in the same faces in the same places, excluded from class mobility. Perhaps it is time to try cultural subsidiarity as an alternative to rebuild the cultural and economic resources in the Black community and to escape the status of Black people as being perpetual wards of the American administrative state. The Black church, as the last major pro-social institution left in these communities, could serve as the catalyst to ignite the beginning of a new movement to accomplish this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kenneth. That was good.
Amen.
So we're going to hear one more paper from Luis Kahn from University of Santiago, Chile. Long way.
Long way indeed. Hi everyone, thanks to Telos for this very interesting event. Well, my paper is Latin-American-style Dominionism, the Crypto-Schmittian logic of neo-Pentecostal political theologies. I want to say that English is not my native language, so I will read the paper. Sorry for that. Well, in recent years, Latin America has been an object of international analysis because of the rise of something we could call evangelical politics. There is, for instance, the case of Brazil, where evangelicals were actively involved in the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and also in the support of the new president, Jair Bolsonaro. There is the case of Guatemala, where the current president is evangelical. Evangelicals also played a role in the peace process in Colombia between President Juan Manuel Santos and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. That's why some news stories speak about an evangelical rise or evangelical power in Latin America, often linked to conservative ideas, which is to say right-wing ideologies. This last point is due to the fact that evangelical politics in the region has been strongly opposed to gay marriage and abortion. This phenomenon of evangelical politics, however, is not new. It has been discussed by many sociologists and researchers like Jean-Pierre Bastian, David Stoll, and many others. Usually the framework of the discussion has been the theory of secularization and its applicability in the region in terms of social change and political interest. In this context, fundamentalism is one of the key terms to analyze the influence of American evangelicals over evangelicals in Latin America. There was also the very important phenomenon of Christian liberationism, liberation theologies and so on, and of course the support of evangelical to some dictatorships, as happened in Chile and Guatemala. In this analysis, I would like to stress 2 points. The pertinence of using the term Dominionism for specific Latin American evangelical groups involved in political issues, and second, analyze the current evangelical rise in the region from a Crypto-Schmittian view, considering the changes that have taken place in the Western world. Even though today there is a rise of evangelicals in politics, the category of Dominionism still has not been part of the debate in our region. This is understandable because the debate over the term belongs mainly to American politics. After all, it is in America where it was firstly used to nominalize either Reconstructionists or Kingdom Now Christians. Also, as has been noted, it is a term that was not used by these groups to define themselves. It was a label used by their critics, and it didn't have a clear definition in the beginning. Reconstructionists and Kingdom Now Christians are very different. The theology of the first is strongly rooted on Orthodox Reformed Protestantism.
Right.
Meanwhile, the theology of the second comes from the New Apostolic Reformation. The unifying element that makes them Dominionists is the fact that both systems of ideas suggest that Christians should, I quote, take dominion over the civic institutions of society. Close quote. Regarding the use of the term, there are some warnings. First, it's necessary to take the advice of McBeaver regarding the fact that Dominionism is a term used mainly in a negative way, dividing evangelicals. And second, that the term has been used by journalists and popular media to characterize a group as radical and extreme. So in the view of McBeaver, it can be useful insofar as it is free from these meanings. On the other hand, why could this concept be useful to describe some evangelical trends in Latin America? It is clear that in the region, evangelicals are different in many ways from North American ones, and the same can be said about the differences in context. However, many of them hold the idea that Christians should take dominion over politics and society. That's why they can be considered dominionists in a broad sense. Also, as this is a general category, it is necessary to point out that dominionist trends in Latin America come mainly from Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal groups. That's the whole issue. But at the same time, given the differences between contexts, what are the particular elements of this Latin American style dominionism? This question will lead us to the Crypto-Schmittian element in these political theologies. I have selected 3 cases. Johnny Enlow, a North American Neo-Pentecostal, very known in our region. Harold Caballeros, Guatemalan Neo-Pentecostal, and Rodolfo Torres, a Chilean Pentecostal. They have been chosen not because of their influence, but because of their conceptual work on the relationship between religion and politics from a confessional point of view. First, Enlow. Enlow is one of the inspirers of dominionism in some circles. He is an American Neo-Pentecostal pastor and is well known among his followers because of his 7-mountain prophecy. In short, through the symbolic figure of 7 mountains, Enlow stresses that there are 7 areas of human life that Christians must seek to rule: mass media, government, education, economy, religion, celebration, feasts, and family. Regarding politics, Enlow states that government is probably the most important mountain, and also affirms that Lucifer is entrenched as a usurper on this mountain. That's why he suggests the need that practicing Christians must take this mountain to rule in his place. He also affirms that Christians in power must be apostolic, so they can make spiritual warfare and overcome corruption in a spiritual way. He calls for a holy invasion, I quote, of Washington, D.C. and hails Christian ministries interacting with American politics. In his model, he rejects 2 specific public policies as demonic: abortion and gay marriage. He also stresses the need to understand God's plan for Israel in the end times, these times. Curiously, these 3 topics have been very important for conservative evangelicals in their political positions, not only in North America, but also in South America. ELO could easily be a roadmap for evangelicals interested in politics. In general terms, ELO's discourse resembles much of what Latin American evangelicals say in politics. But what are the new elements on the local scene? Harold Caballeros is the first example. This Guatemalan neo-Pentecostal pastor, businessman, lawyer, politician wrote a book called Revival, Reformation, and Restoration, where he maintains that spiritual revival, a very common term among Pentecostals and neo-Pentecostals, must have consequences in all spheres of human reality, or human life in general, which includes politics. Noting the spiritual warfare taking place in all areas of life, he sees Christian, Pentecostal engagement in politics as a spiritual war. Caballeros holds that social evils such as violence and corruption are consequences of human disobedience to God. In this way, he suggests that Christians are called to politics in order to establish a Christian worldview, which is understood as principles and values that have consequences in material life. This concept is a positive and uncritical reading of Max Weber's thesis about the Protestant ethos as a basis for capitalist development. This is how Caballeros articulates Neo-Pentecostal view of spiritual reality and the Weberian thesis of Protestant ethics. The specific Latin American element is the application of this idea to his context, of course. For Caballeros, values of Anglo-Protestant culture are totally opposed, in his words, to the values of Spanish Catholic culture, which molded Latin America. In his theory, the effects of Protestantism, or Christian worldview, opposed to Catholicism, are capitalism, freedom, justice, and many other blessings, which, according to this narrative, would be absent in a Catholic culture. This is why Caballeros holds that Latin America has to become Protestant through a strong evangelization and discipleship of the region. This Protestantism is strongly informed by the idea that the only solution for making better societies is that Christians who are aware of the spiritual roots of the problem engage in politics in order to redeem the world for Christ. Third example, Rodolfo Torres, Chilean. This is a Pentecostal pastor. He's director of the first so-called evangelical think tank of the country called Chile Cristiano, like a Christian Chile. Torres moves in some neo-Pentecostal political interest groups, but he's more an intellectual than a political evangelical figure. In this role, he has shaped a clear idea about how Chile should be. His intellectual project is very clear: to make Chile a Christian country, which means evangelical, and precisely Pentecostal. In his book, Chile Cristiano, he traces the supposed influence of an Anglo-American Protestant tradition over Chile, taking account of relevant political figures that helped to shape the country in times of the independence and relevant missionaries. He remarks that the Pentecostal revival was led by an American Methodist pastor, Willis Hoover, and also notes that Pentecostals are the biggest evangelical faction in the country. In theoretical terms, Torres follows the idea of Eugenio Tironi, a Chilean sociologist, who developed the concept of the Americanizing revolution, which describes the process of the country's modernization since Pinochet's dictatorship in areas like the economic system, cultural assimilation, and others. Although Tironi is skeptical regarding the phenomenon, for Torres, the role of Christians is to give a push to the Americanizing process. Like Caballeros, Torres is reluctant to recognize Spanish Catholic heritage and also shares a positive reception of the Weberian thesis regarding the role of the Protestant ethics for capitalist European culture, pointing out the relevance of the evangelical doctrine of work. He affirms that the chosen, I quote, the chosen societal paradigm to replicate in our society is inspired by the cultural system built by the American people, mainly in areas like religion and foreign policy. More explicitly, Torres suggests that the process of Americanization that began in September 11, 1973, which is the day of Pinochet's coup d'etat, should be called Christian instead of American.
Lord, that's crazy.
Well, on the other hand, Torres, unlike Caballeros, is not emphatic on spiritual warfare. Also, unlike Caballeros, he is highly interested in the role of Israel. He is probably the main promoter of Christian Zionism in Chile and also has a very harsh discourse against Islam and Arab countries. How can you speak bad about Islamic culture in Chile, where we have a very little community of Muslim people and so on? At the same time, he's highly critical of Bolivarianism in the region. Bolivarianism, the ideology of, unifying the region, and of the progressivism that the European Union represents regarding topics like abortion and gay marriage. Okay. So, the Crypto-Schmittian logic. Crypto-Schmittian logic. The term Crypto-Schmittianism was coined by Simon Critchley to describe what he sees as a new phenomenon that began with the attack on the World Trade Center in 9/11. For Critchley, Schmittianism understands politics as the construction of an enemy to maintain the unity of citizenry. In this way, with the fall of the Soviet Union and global communism, there was the need to have a new global enemy. This role was given to Muslim terrorism. However, with this new enemy, there is a change, a hypocrisy about the political, he says. That is to say, there is a depoliticizing view of politics. This depoliticizing process, in which freedom, human rights, and democracy are the key ideological topics, is related to the conjunction of faith and politics. Critchley holds that there is a triangulation of faith that permits a moralization of political judgment on a metaphysical basis, which in the end points to God as the depoliticizing instance par excellence. Thus, a political decision made in the context of friend versus enemy can be linked to God's will. One of the core elements of Crypto-Schmittianism as depoliticizing logic is the triangulation of faith, politics, and morality, as exemplified in the case of Bush, who, according to Critchley, has transformed Christianity into an imperial civil religion with considerable populist appeal, particularly around core moral issues of opposition to abortion and gay marriage. Again, these two topics. Currently, these two issues have been very effective for the political agenda of right-wing movements in Latin America and also for gaining evangelicals' favor in the region. This superficial similarity can be understood in a deeper sense from a Crypto-Schmittian point of view. If faith or religious beliefs can be depoliticizing as a way to explain politics from a moral and metaphysical point of view, then Dominionism can be understood as depoliticizing insofar work as a religion explanation for political issues. So, Dominionism as Schmittian logic, to the extent that it conceives as enemy everything that is opposed to Christianity, Crypto-Schmittian, I will start with this. Dominionism has a Schmittian logic to the extent that it conceives as enemy everything that is opposed to Christianity, which means evangelical. The Crypto-Schmittian step comes when the political enemy is understood under the religious logic of spiritual warfare. Then, for instance, Catholicism and Islam are political problems not because of their political stance, but because they are religious or religion. This is not new. Decades ago, communism was resisted because it was atheist, especially in the region, of course. This was one of the main arguments of evangelicals. Okay. In other words, a political enemy is read under a religious view of politics. Also, it is not an accident that Dominionist theologies are interested in the Israel issue. As they are concerned with the end times, their support of Israel takes place inside the framework of the new global enemy of Islam terrorism. So the global political enemy is also religious. Dominionism is also depoliticizing its view of progress, as accepts uncritically the Weberian thesis of the relationship between the Protestant ethic and capitalism, it tends to stress that political and economic change can only be produced through a religious change. So it transforms political and economic issues into religious ones. Furthermore, this proto-program for transforming Latin America is part of the idea that it is necessary to lead a religious change in the region. In this way, they imagine a Protestantized continent that would have similar results to North America's in political and economic issues. This Protestantization is synonymous with the idea of Christianization. So the progress of the region depends on religion. The complex idea that Anglo-American prosperity is rooted in Protestant religion makes one think that Protestantization would lead Latin America to an American way of life. That is why it is possible to say that for Latin American Dominionists, to Christianize is to Americanize. Americanize? Okay, so just one more word. Religious populism in Latin America can be understood from a Crypto-Schmittian point of view, under the assumption that issues like gay marriage and abortion can mobilize religious groups in the political arena through a religious epistemology. Finally, I would like to say that Latin American-style dominionism, considered from a Crypto-Schmittian view, can be considered a new functional strategy to create and foster an imagined community based on religious motives with political goals such as the reinforcement of Western identity based on the ideas of economic progress and modernization. Thank you.
So I'm sure this has inspired a lot of questions and commentary, so let's get started.
Thank you very much, all of you, for really edifying papers. I wanted to make a comment on Valerie's paper. I was struck first when you said qualified men are needed to rule. Yeah, now all we have to do is find men who are qualified. But I wanted to talk about how deeply rooted this particular evangelical racism is by pointing to the paradox of white evangelical rejection of Christian, historical, critical, intellectual, biblical exegesis. And the paradox is that this comes from the most democratic part of American evangelicalism, this grassroots American evangelicalism, where everybody, the priesthood of all believers, where every Joe and Mary on the frontier could read the Bible and grasp its import. And as we know from the early 20th century, with the importation of the German historical critical school, these grassroots evangelicals, the most vibrant, Tocquevillian, democratic aspects of white evangelicalism, of course, felt threatened by this German school as elitist, requiring high education, philology, ancient archaeology, ancient languages, and so on, and of course, and felt threatened. And in response, produced the fundamentals pamphlets and a tragic defensive retrenchment away from Christianity's own intellectual exegetical traditions. And we can think of Mark Noble's Closing of the Evangelical Mind and much other work in that area. And so I'm thinking about the...
I want to suggest, though, that they weren't, Princeton Theological produced them, right? They popularized the fundamentals.
Oh, yeah, right. But there was a grassroots receptors.
That's right.
Oh, yeah, I mean, and oil magnates distributed the fundamentals.
That's right.
No, that's right. But in thinking of how this then fed into the racism, which of course, without question, must be rejected, that we also have to understand that the rejection of Christianity's own intellectual traditions was a really tragic defensive response to the sense of threat by white evangelicals. So when people feel threatened, I'm not endorsing the response. I'm just noting how strong that sense of being when people feel under threat and condescended to, that their emotional response is very powerful a motivator. And so the racism you're talking about is facing this level of powerful motivation.
Yes,
So-
absolutely. I think that's quite right. So the point that you made that the Black church doesn't have any religious terrorism traditions is because we've been the victims of religious terrorism, right? Again and again, for little girls, right? Going on their way to Sunday school. I heard this on MSNBC this morning, Morning Joe. There was discussion about Donald Trump supporters and whether or not they've been cheated. And the commentator said, no, they haven't been cheated. They got what they sought, racism and sexism. Now we're at homophobia, right? And Donald Trump has actually delivered on that. He hasn't delivered on the wall, but he has delivered on riots in places like Charlottesville, right? Ultimately, though, I think that we need to think very seriously about the ways that American evangelicalism has been situated by racism. I mean, by biblical defenses of slavery, for example, and that sort of thing doesn't go away. I think that ultimately it is the greatest challenge facing American religious life, and I would say that because in my study of American revivalism, they're always integrated, right? So that this racial segregation has resulted in a kind of death of the church. Yeah.
I'd like to also comment on that. I think the white conservative evangelical movement, right, or as I call them, the white religious nationalists, these folks are the walking dead.
Bob Jones said at the end of white Christian America.
Yeah, and you know, they have their fun now, and they might get a second term in Mr. Trump.
And mercy.
But it's interesting how they've cut themselves off of the nourishing roots of ancient historic Christianity.
Yeah, their own religion.
Their own religion.
They're losing their own children.
Yeah, and their children are leaving because they detest the racism, the homophobia, the nativism. You never hear about the early church fathers or the desert fathers or any of the other early ancient Christians in Africa.
Right.
Where there wasn't racism there. Racism is a modern problem. It's a product of late Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which evangelicals themselves decry. So there are just so many interlocking contradictions that they basically nullify themselves. They are the walking dead. And I think they're eventually going to run out of power.
This is an issue that we don't even see, right? A. Church Geneva said that in Social Social Denominationalism, that racism is so acceptable, a thing that we don't even apologize for churches that are more segregated than the neighborhoods they're in. That doesn't even strike us as at all strange.
I'd like to connect the dots to South America. I spent some time in Chile. Quickly. Came down to Chile, had a meeting sponsored by the Manhattan Institute to come down and do some consulting with pastors about some gang work that I've done in the United States. So they fly me down, take this Ritz-Carlton, real upmarket Manhattan Institute kind of stuff. So I'm in a meeting with all of these more German-looking white Chileans.
You went
Total.
high place.
No, it was a high place. You know, so we're slumming at the Ritz-Carlton. So we're all there, and they're talking about religion. And these were the typical cosmopolitan, rootless, intellectually illiterate elites. I mean, you had to love the drink. I'm just right. So at one point, I asked them. I say, "Well, tell me about the Pentecostal churches in Chile." So, right on beat, there are no Pentecostals in Chile.
Oh, stop.
I fell out. No, we're good. So I said, I know what I'm working with here, this idiot, right? So I say, listen, I've never been to Chile a day in my life, this is my first time here. I guarantee you, you get any one of your guys in your office, they're a very fancy place, right? And have them just make a couple of phone calls. And they're gonna come back and tell me where the big Pentecostal church is in this town, as it turns out. True to form, hour and a half later, yeah, and what was interesting, you know, what is called evangelical in the United States is really Pentecostal.
Yes.
No. So the evangelical thing is a lie. What it's really about is Pentecostalism. Now, the upwardly mobile Pentecostals try to tag themselves with that when it's convenient. And it's a lie, but they're whitening themselves in that they want to be like the North Americans, who for them are the whites. They're not the black churches, right? So I go. So what happens, so they say, well, we're gonna go to these churches. They never even known that this existed. So we went to the church of the son of the major pastor. So it's 1,000 people, first service. 9 o'clock service, 1,000 people, hallelujah, they're just jumping around, not quite as intense as black church, but they were doing their best, right? You know, and a lot of Mapuche Indians, or whatever those brothers are on the mountains, right? So the dark skin, flat hair, you know, right? So the father calls and says, I was really tired. We'd like to have Reverend Rivers and his wife be our guests at the evening service. Oh my God. Right? Because we were in church for 3 hours that morning with your folks, right? So I go back to the hotel, I just want to stay in, watch CNN, order an expensive steak, and just call it a day, right? So I'm deprived. So we get up at 5:30. We go to a warehouse on the periphery of downtown central Santiago. It's a beat up looking warehouse. It was poorly heated. In there were 20,000 people for the 6 o'clock service. You know, and the Chilean fancy white people, they could not believe it. So as it turns out, the bishop knew my bishop, Charles Blake, because there's an international network of these guys, and they know each other all around the world. So I say, I'm from Bishop Blake's, he's my bishop. They yank me up, speak not a word of Spanish. I greet, you know, que pasa, whatever, right? Right? I greet them. The people go nuts. Now, my point is, there's a racial thing. There's a racial dimension to everything you described. The whole Reconstructionist deal were racist whites, another variation of what you described, right?
If you want to go deeper on this, now in Chile there is a high level conflict with Mapuche people in the Aránguiz region.
That's right.
And there are Mapuche people who are Pentecostals, and there are revolutionary Mapuches.
Yes, sir.
Well, there is a huge issue.
Okay, look,
You can speak about that.
no, we'll talk about that. But see, the race issue was so deep, and it was recognizable immediately.
Yeah.
I walked in, 20,000 Mapuche Indians. They got the flat hair, they had white shirts, black pants, you know, were living in the mountains, got sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost, don't drink anymore, don't smoke, don't slap the wife or beat the dog. And they're in church all the time, and it's transformed their lives. In Guatemala, the Pentecostals are working the prisons in one of the craziest stories you've ever heard, where those, whatever the Mapuche equivalent is in Guatemala, they're working the gangs, and the gangs have opted to have churches established in the prison, and the leaders of the prisons are the pastors, but all these dudes have got the tattoo stuff that scares you to death. They're all tattooed, the whole thing, and so there is a revolutionary movement at the base, and these guys are rejecting the hegemony of the white elites. So there's a subtext racial piece, right, that hasn't exploded. And so
So Americanization is really about also adopting Americans' racial categories.
whiteness
I don't know, they don't formulate it
that way.
But the idea of they have idealized the idea of America as an
America's white.
yeah.
It ain't black. So Americanization is whiteness.
Culture is the culture that gave capitalism and progress, so they take that part of America, of course. There is no black America for them in their reading. Yeah. And also, if you try to find the issue of black people in America, you can't find it in their writings
in
because
South
they don't
America.
engage with the racial issue.
Well, let's push it. In South America, you've got blacks in these other countries, Uruguay, Peru, and these stuff. There's a black population in all these countries who are denied. In Mexico, you have substantial black communities on the coast of Mexico where they dropped off the slaves. They never left. So what I'm suggesting is that your analysis, I agree with. Ken Johnson knows the history of a lot of this craziness. There is a racial dynamic that is going to come to the surface. And in the Chilean case, it will be the Mapuche.
Yeah, of course I'm giving an overview, but it has a deep point on that, and it's something we can continue studying, I think, because there is no right about it that way, especially in the political field. You know, Mapuche issue still is not a political problem for evangelicals, but of course there is a cultural discrimination. People with Mapuche sometimes in the churches is not well considered, and yeah.
And it's
We
racial
can find that,
discrimination.
but it is not that strong as it is here.
No,
Yes.
but
But there
go ahead, sorry.
We're gonna take one last question, and we'll have to take the conversation out.
So this has been fascinating, a wonderful panel, great discussion, but I would like to come back to the United States and Valerie and Ken and come and return us to this difficult question of segregation in Christianity, in Protestantism in particular, as we're talking about. In the discussion, it sounded more as if this were an evangelical problem. What about, the non-evangelicals? If you go to the high-end churches in the suburb, are these any more desegregated?
They tend to be more segregated than evangelical churches, the mainline Protestant churches, because ultimately for a reason that's more instrumental than intentional. When a church is founded, it tends to be founded with a racial identification. And so mainline denominational churches were founded during Jim Crow, for the most part. They're older congregations and older buildings. So what happens is the neighborhood changes, the church doesn't change, it just dies. People drive in from further and further out. So mainline denominational churches, all of whom have a statement on racism, they're against it, are the most difficult to integrate. And ultimately, a lot of this happens because of the ways that, if you go to visit a church, people let you know that you're in the wrong place. The reason why most southern towns have two, Baptist churches, one black and one white, was that the white Baptist church gave the black people a little piece of money, said, y'all go on the other side of the railroad track and be there, right? And so people there, all of the informal doorkeepers like ushers and choir directors and the like who enforce this, whether or not the pastor wants it. But from the moment you step into the sanctuary of a place, if you are the wrong race, people let you know. I mean, I've had that experience where every seat was taken on Easter except the seat next to me. Or had the experience of being a member of the choir and being expected to join them for their Veterans Day service out by the Confederate Monument. I said I couldn't. I deferred. So, this is deep, and this is a problem. This is, I think, the main problem of American evangelicalism. And American evangelicals continue to shut it down. I mean, the way that they've handled, for example, abortion is they say you shouldn't vote for somebody who's pro-abortion. If they were that proactive about racism would be resolved. But I mean, ultimately what happens is that there's a racist incident and evangelicals rush to say that wasn't racism. And they don't know any black people. So let's talk about homosexuality, right? It used to be that people were in the closet and no one knew who the gay people were. Now kids come out in junior high school and high school, right? And so all of the millennials and the Generation X, they know people who are gay, and their attitudes towards homosexuality have changed as a result. Because American society is as segregated as it is, and most white people don't have a close black friend, and most black people would not tell their white friends, you know, their colleagues at work or what have you, the real deal about black life. We haven't had the same sorts of conversations about race that our children have had about sexuality. Right? And so ultimately the continuing segregation of American society works to prevent us from getting past this. And for someone to issue a theological statement and say, we will not talk about this, it's a sin that we will not talk about, suggests to me that they're not serious about fixing it, because the way evangelicals respond to every sin is with a 12-point plan.
One other thing I would mention, extremely quick, it's notable that while Reverend King gave the criticism about 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, he never did advocate for the merger or assimilation of black churches into white churches.
No, and neither am I.
Yeah, no, I'm saying this for the benefit of the audience and future audiences. Sadly, we are stuck. And we now have to make some practical steps on how to work with what we have. Openness to integration and cultural diversity, obviously, but also taking the resources that we have and moving forward.
Well, so here's a radical suggestion. Rather than destroy black churches, why don't white people go to black churches?
Not white.
Some will, right? And some shouldn't, right? But if the issue is whiteness, if whiteness is a thing that is both invisible to white people and prevents white people from interacting normally with other people, if the construction of whiteness is that whiteness is normal and everything else is abnormal, then it is that whiteness that is the problem. In the same way that when you travel abroad, you learn about Americanism because you see other people and you learn there are other ways to be in the world, I suggest that black churches are places where white people can unlearn whiteness, because black churches are places that celebrate blackness, where black people are loved by God, right? And most whites have not had the experience of interacting with black people as equals. And even in white churches, there's usually a patron-client attitude that black people, that we're gonna give you some services. And since whites typically have greater wealth than blacks, we'll continue to operate on an economic scale. So my suggestion is that white people, don't so many people go that it stops being a black church, but that white people go to black churches and unlearn whiteness. Is actually my suggestion.
Without provocation.